Hey everybody, this is Jamil with Infinity Vans. I'm here to show you how to install our Infinity Vans base kit system. This is going to be the first video in a multi-part series on how to install the Infinity Vans interior system. So be sure to subscribe so that you can be in the loop on future install videos, and let's get started. So there's a few things you need to get done before you can install the base kit system. You need to make sure that all the windows are cut out and installed. You need to make sure that if you're doing a skylight and fan, that those are cut out and installed as well. And we also need to make sure that all the larger gauge wiring is run from the exterior of the van to the interior where the wiring will be junctioned. So if you're doing a control panel, say up in the front of the van, up in the upper cabinet, you're going to need to run your main wiring from that control panel to the rear of the van where the main power system is. And if you're doing shore power, that'll need to be installed. And you'll need to make sure your solar jack is installed. So once all that's done, now we're ready to begin the installation of the base kit system. So step one is to install the kill mat. And the kill mat is twofold for our kit. One is sound deadening, which is the most obvious reason. But secondly, it's to create a barrier between the wood and the metal, because the wood on metal can squeak. So we're trying to give a solid point between the two materials so that we don't have any of that. While we like to put the kill mat everywhere in the van, if weight is of concern to you, then you can focus just on the high points. So really you can see in the van that there's ribs that protrude beyond other points. So we're really focusing on the high points, just so any place that the wood will be touching will have kill mat. So the one thing that we don't want to do is cover the center line at the C column on the vertical plane of the van, because that center line is actually what we use for aligning the panels. So we want to just leave the kill mat away from that center line just a little bit so we can access that for alignment. Step two is doing all the pre-installation in the frame of the van. So there will be a secondary step for insulation, but initially we need to put all of the wool insulation into the smaller cavities, like up above the windshield, into basically any place that is going to be harder to get the wool insulation in once the sub panel is installed. So the next step is installing the sub panel on the floor. The sub panels are a solid substrate so that they improve both sound deadening and thermal insulation. In terms of the alignment on the sub panels, we're looking for alignments in the rear of the van. The sub panel should come just to the roundover point of the threshold piece in the rear. So we're really looking for a nice straight line all the way across, and we're going to be looking at the side-to-side alignment, just making sure that our gapping is fairly similar to each side. And then if we come around the other side of the van, the alignment that we're using for the sub panel is to face out with the body right at this point. So we're really looking for these two to be coplanar. And once we have these in plane, when we put the finish panels on, everything should be really flush and really even. And you can see here, hopefully not too well, this is the culmination of all the alignment. There's 4 panels here that come together all within a couple of inches. And you should be able to kind of run your hand over this and not feel that big of a difference. You shouldn't see any gapping here, really. There isn't a need for that. So that's really where we're looking for our sort of correct alignment if everything works out well here. So in terms of fastening the sub panel, there's a couple of factors to consider. We want the screws in the sub panel to go through the sub panel and into the high point or the ridge, and not the valley of the floor. So while we're putting them down, we're going to make little tick marks on the sub panel to show where the high points of those ribs are. And secondly, we have the gas tank to consider. So there's one of two things that we can do for that. We can avoid it altogether, and we can put our screws to each side and all the way at the other end, or we can use shorter screws. We use as a standard 1.5" self-tapping fast caps. But in this case, around the gas tank, we'll use a 1-inch self-tapper. So you could either avoid it or you could use the 1-inch screws. Step 4 is going to be installing the finish panels. And the only thing that you really need to know about installing the finish panels is they just need to align with the sub panels. So we have a very definitive alignment point. Once the sub panel's in, the finish panel should align exactly with the sub panels. So when you run your hand over this joint where these 4 panels come together, there shouldn't be any real noticeable difference in that. So that tells me that everything is in alignment from that point on. And the other thing to consider when putting the finish floor in is whether it's getting another treatment on the top of the finish floor. So in this case, it's getting a lawn seal floor. So we're not worried about penetrating the top of the finish floor. But if this were going to be a scene finish floor, if there was laminate, or if there was something that was already applied to the material, we obviously wouldn't want to puncture that. We would use a construction adhesive, and in this case, along this edge, we would clamp it. And oftentimes I'll use some micro pins, either from the underside or just right on top. If I know that those areas are going to be covered, like in this case, we would do a cabinet over this, so I wouldn't be concerned with puncturing the floor in some cases. But it just all depends on the treatment of the finish floor. As we are getting into installing the wall sub panels, one thing that you're going to want to take note of is if you have flare space and flare trim, the flare trim is going to want to go in before the sub panels are installed. So we basically just fit the flare trim in, and then as it's loosely in, we start putting the sub panels over. And one of the things that the flare, if it just is sitting in without any fastening, it can tend to get a little kind of tinny and rattly. So what we do is we pre-drill our fast cap screws through the panels and into the flare space trim, and then we actually use the same fasteners that we're using for the sub panels to fasten the flare space trim to the sub panel, so then we get a really nice solid connection. So one of the things we'll want to take note of as well in our pre-installation for the sub panels for both walls and ceiling is we have an alignment point on the body of the Sprinter, which is at the C column. And it's basically just a seam where the 2 frame points come together. It's a very distinct point. So the long seam here wants to always be on center of that frame point. So when we put one panel up, we'll align this point to the frame, and we'll just want to be sure that that is aligned all the way up and down. And then on the other side, on the passenger side, it's the same point, but in a different way, in that this is the same sort of midpoint. And we'll just want to be sure that the sub panel is parallel and flush to this part of the frame, the little kind of outcrop. And then we follow that up all the way to that same center point. You can see a little indent in the frame. And so those are the 2 main points for the walls. And then as far as the ceiling, in our sub panel, we have 2 threaded inserts that are in the middle point of the middle sub panel. And we put those there so that we can actually put finish screws into that insert and have the finish screws actually protrude beyond the sub panel. And then we put that into the 2 factory holes that are in the center of the frame. So we use that as our sort of pre-alignment. So we put this panel up with the third hand, we keep it stable, get it aligned to the frame, and then we put the other 2 sub panels up, keep those in line with the third hand as well. And what we have then is all 3 sub panels are at least pinned to the ceiling, and they're not fastened yet, so that we can check our alignment all the way down on the side. What we're really looking for is a fairly consistent gap of anywhere from say 1 to 1.25 inches all the way down. And it doesn't have to be perfect, because there's going to be little waves like in the sub panels with the walls, just sort of natural to how the subframe fits to the wall. But we'll just want to be sure that we have fairly straight alignment. And there's actually something to take note of as well in the rear of the Sprinter is it's sort of a high point in the frame. I call it like a pinch point, because it basically, the frame pinches a little bit, like it comes in about 1/2 inch or 5/8. So there's a natural kind of bump in the sub panel. So it's going to pinch right back here, but I've also accommodated for a bit of that in the sub panel. So you're going to see like a little sort of natural curve in the sub panel, and then we've also accounted for that in the finish panel. So there's a little slight curve in that panel, but it's definitely something to take note of because it looks like an imperfection, but it's just part of the frame of the Sprinter. So once the ceiling is aligned, then we can go ahead and finish screwing it off. So now knowing all the alignment points, we're going to start installing the wall sub panels on the driver's side. The first panel that's going to go in on the driver's side is referred to as D2 sub. It's the second panel back from the driver's seat. So the reason we install that is because of the alignment point.
Panel number one.
Panel number one. So the way that I know how, like, where these go is I'm looking for that, like the frame point right here that is made to go around this this little cutout in the body. We're aligning the outside of this panel with the actual seam of the van. It's our best alignment point.
Okay.
And then we're gonna get the third hand against the body on that side.
On these, like, would you blow in all of the screws now? Just do all of the fasteners now, or get the next panel up just in case an adjustment needs to be made?
I usually like to get 3 screws.
Okay.
And then once they're all in, then we can go through and just fire off all the rest.
Okay, cool.
So we're going to continue with the installation of D3 and then D4 and D1 so that the entire wall sub-panel system is installed, but only with a few screws per panel, just to keep them in place. Then what we're going to do is verify that the entirety of the 4 panels aren't kind of skewed or racked, in that we need to make sure that the alignment to the finished floor is fairly consistent. There can be a little inconsistency, but we just want to be sure that, you know, in doing the first panel, that center alignment, if it's slightly off, it'll throw the first panel down. Let's say it's slightly off, you know, in one direction. It can throw the front panel down too low and the rear panels up too high. So we just want to verify that everything's sort of in plane. And once we get done with the walls on the driver's side, we're going to move over to the passenger side and do P1, which is the first panel closest to the passenger seat. And we'll do the same thing with a few screws in the second panel. There's only 2 panels on the passenger side, 2 sub panels. So next we're going to be putting in the ceiling sub panels. You're going to want to start with panel C2, which is the second panel back from the front. And that has the inbuilt alignment points, and you're going to align it to those 2 ceiling points, and you're going to use a third hand to jack it into place and hold it while we put in the first and third sub panels as well. And all of those are going to be dry fit with third hands together, no screws, so that we can check the alignment along the driver's side to the wall sub panels. And we're looking for, you know, kind of a 0 to 1/8 inch tolerance. Like, there's going to be like little waverings here and there, but generally speaking, front to back, we want it to be, you know, within about an 1/8 inch. And that's going to give us really good alignment for the finish panels. So once the alignment looks good throughout, you put all the rest of the screws in, and then you're done with the sub panels. Strong paddles. A little climbing.
Oh, wow.
So now that you have the sub panels installed, we're going to do the rest of the wool installation. And this is where you're going to want to fill all the rest of the installation spots with the wool insulation. And one thing to kind of keep in mind about the wool insulation is that you don't want to pack it really tight. One of the things that is unique about wool is it actually works better when it has just a little bit of fluff to it, kind of like a down comforter. Next, we're going to be installing the wiring in the sub panels. And we have Jeremy from Vanland, please subscribe to his channel, that's going to show you how to do that.
The Infinity sub panel system and the wire channels that are in it, this is actually pretty fun. So what we're going to do is we've located the spot where our switch panel is going to go. So we basically run power from the power system to the switch panel with some fairly large gauge wire. And then once the power's at the switch panel, we can run all of the utilities off of there, like our pump, our fan, our lights. So I'll show you guys how it's done. We've started by running some heavier gauge wire from the battery system to the switch panel, which is going to go right here. And so we've got power coming to the switch panel, and from there we'll run the wires through the channels to each of the utilities. Here's an example of how we do it. Take the fan, for instance. Our fan is located right here. We've already wired it into a 12 gauge wire. And so really all we need to do is find a good channel like this. The wires fit right in, and then we will feed this back to the power panel, which is going to go right here. So once the panel goes up, we'll wire this into a switch and we'll have power to the fan that we can turn on and off right from the panel. So the important thing here is that the switch panel, which is going to go right here, in order to wire it up, you really need to like pull the panel all the way down and like work on it, because it's going to have a ton of wires coming off of it. So we like to leave like that much wire so that when the panel comes out,
2 to 3 feet.
actually even a little more, something like that, just to make it really easy, because otherwise you're trying to wire a panel that's kind of up in the air and it's super difficult. So this is going to the fridge, right? So we're going to start here, and I'm just going to put this in here to hold it, but we're going to look for the best channel to get power to the fridge. So there's a number of different ways we could do it. Each of these is a power hub, meaning like they'll have access through all your panels to get to these locations. So let's take this for instance. We could run it up through a channel like this over to there. So let's see if we have enough wire for that. I'm just going to feed it in. Let's go through here. And actually, if you're going up, you typically want to use the highest channel so that you don't have to cross as many wires. The great thing about these channels is if you use the right kind of wire, it just fits right in and it secures itself until the finished panels are up, which will actually lock it in. Just makes it really easy. The fridge is going to be in the galley right here, right? So all we need to do is run this down, roll this up a little bit, and just stick it right there for the moment. That's it. How easy is that? Running a wire pretty much anywhere in the van, right through the channels. The cool thing too is that you can see it. If you needed to trace a wire back, rather than having a big bundle of wires running through the metal channels, which are pretty much like, you don't know what's in there unless it's labeled all along the wire, I can clearly see exactly where this wire is coming and move it if I need to, or do some rearrangement as things change. So yeah, that's it. So now we're going to go through and we'll just label where everything's going to go, like where the pump power needs to run to, where the USB power needs to run, and then you'll just fill the channels and keep the wires labeled so that when you get to the end and you pull it out, it's clear as to what it is. We have now wired in the fan, but with these cool little connectors, we're going to be able to power the skylight off of this as well. And all you really do is we're going to grab another wire that'll run back to the skylight, and we just tap in positive and negative here. So that way, when this comes over, everything, when you switch this off, everything on the ceiling goes off. And we're going to run the lights off of this too. So the key is not to overload these wires. We use 12 gauge so that there's a little bit of extra capacity to add things to it. You could go down to like 14 or 16 gauge, but also 12 gauge fits in the channel, so it's really great to use that. But yeah, let's grab another wire. So we'll go from here back to the skylight and they'll be on the same circuit. Going back into the positive terminal here. And then here's the negative. Make sure they're nice and tight. And then this one, we can run right through this channel. So you can also do it in the channels here, but since it's so easy to pull through.
Are we going all the way through?
Yeah.
Up top?
Yeah, you go ahead and pull it from that side. Keep going. Pull this through. And then Boom, right there. Positive and negative. Just strip those off.
Bada bing,
That's it.
bada boom.
How simple is that? So we just wired up the fan and the skylight on the same circuit in just a couple minutes. And yeah, what I really love about this is that you're not hiding your wiring. I mean, until the finished panels go up, you can still have access to every part in here. And like I said, make a change, add another appliance to it. Just a really slick system that makes wiring a lot more fun than it used to be.
One of the great things about the sub panels and the wiring is that we get to anticipate some future needs because we're still going to have access to those, what we call access ports in the finished panel system. So one of the things we like to do when we're running the wiring through like what we call our home runs, going from different point to point, is we like to loop the wiring in the access points so that for future expansion needs, we can just cut that wire and junction right into it, and we have excess wire that we can loop out. So the last part of the installation process of the base kit system is the finished panels. In terms of installation of the finished panels, we're gonna wanna start with the walls and do the ceiling last. So the first wall panel that's gonna go in on the driver's side is gonna be D2 again, which is the middle panel. And we do that just so we can get all the alignment points correct, and then we can install D1 and D3. And the methodology for the finished panels is we're gonna compress the panel in as we would the sub panels. We're gonna hand tighten, and this is key with all of the finish screws with the finished panels, is we're gonna wanna hand tighten all the finish screws. So the reason we do that is we don't cross thread anything, because if we use a power tool or another tool, it's pretty easy just to kind of go right at it and start to cross thread the inserts. So I like to put them all in by hand. It's just getting them all started by hand. You can feel it. If things are a little off and you feel like there's a little tension, back it off and start again. They should go in easy, so there shouldn't be a struggle with them. There will be occasionally a finished screw having a little bit of tension because it's touching the wood if things aren't aligned just right. So there's a little differentiation between it touching the wood and cross threading, and that's something we just want to be highly aware of, because it's just a bummer to kind of get into the whole process and then to cross thread one of the inserts and then have to pull everything out to redo that insert. And sometimes it can be really difficult because they get stuck, the finished screws. So we want to mitigate that by being very, very intentional and very careful in starting the screws. So we're going to do the first panel, second, third on the driver's side, and then we're going to do the passenger side, and then lastly we're going to do the ceiling. And something to also be cognizant of is we're going to be hand tightening, and again, we're not going to use power tools for the finished screws at all. We're going to use like a T-handle Allen tool, and we're going to tighten them so that they're, let's say, 90% tightened. Still going to be a little bit of play because we're going to get the walls in, then we're going to do the ceiling, we're going to have them all loosely fit. That's where we're going to get our final adjustments. And we're really just going to use a mallet and like a soft block. When I say soft block, I just mean something that's not going to be, when you hit the edge of the plywood, it's not going to mar the plywood. And if you get something thinner, you can kind of tap on the inner edge of the plywood so that it doesn't mar the outer edge that you're going to see. One thing to take note of with the rearmost ceiling finish panel is the modified skylight flange for the turn skylight is going to want to be installed prior to installing the finish panel. So the flange will go on and the connection will be made prior to putting the ceiling panel in place. And once it's connected and in place, then it gets held up with the third hands and then finish screws put in. And similarly with the lighting, we're going to be sure that the wires are dropped through the holes as we're installing the ceiling so that they're ready to install the lights after. And in terms of the lighting, we're just going to basically make up the lighting and put the wires up under the panels and then clip the lights in place. Once all of our alignments are done and we've gotten all of our seams tight, you know, we're really looking for pretty tight seams. I mean, there's no reason to have many, if any, gaps. We're gonna have some little micro gaps here and there, but nothing major. So once we're done with that, then we're gonna finish tightening all of the screws. And at that point, we're done with installing the base kit. And the only thing that's gonna be left is the junction inserts that go into the cutouts on the finished panels, but we're not necessarily installing those right away. We might install those later on. So there you have it. There's the install of the Infinity Vans base kit system. This is the first video in a series of install videos, so please subscribe to our channel so that you'll know what's coming down the pipeline. And more importantly, we have live in-person builder trainings hosted at our facility here in Santa Rosa, California. Click the link in our description to see the schedule for those upcoming trainings. And thank you so much for watching this video, and we'll see you on the next one. Adios.